Hello and welcome back to this damn idealistic crusade. This video is a review of the 1920 classic silent film Outside the Law in its Universal Pictures 4K restoration and its presentation on the Eureka Region B Blu-ray release. There was also a Region A release by Kino Lorber from the same Universal 4K restoration, but as in most cases where you're choosing between a Kino and Eureka release, the Eureka release is usually technically superior in terms of the encoding and of course has different extras, and I do think overall is the better option of the two. And this fits in with a lot of the other Universal titles and more recent restorations that Eureka's been handling, such as their silent Universal Classics releases. So Outside the Law is a film that is actually quite special because it was lost for a great number of decades. It wasn't really discovered again until a print miraculously turned up in a barn of all places sometime in the 1970s. And since then, they have been able to locate some other print sources, primarily 16 millimeter. So there's at least a little bit more material to use in a restoration, but it's still primarily deriving from that lone 35 millimeter print. It's historically important, of course, because this is an early film or an earlier film collaboration between Todd Browning and Lon Chaney Sr. before they would embark on their more famous work at MGM. But if you're a Browning and Chaney fan coming to this after seeing The Unknown or The Unholy Three, you're definitely going to be disappointed because this is actually a vehicle for the Universal star Priscilla Dean. And they had actually made a film together, all three, Browning directing a Priscilla Dean vehicle with Lon Chaney. And the previous year, 1919's The Wicked Darling, Browning had directed a Priscilla Dean vehicle with Lon Chaney as well. So they were basically reteaming for this film, but this was actually coming out in the wake of Chaney's astounding success in 1920's The Penalty. So he basically was resuming his career as more of a character actor. And unfortunately, he has a relatively smaller part. This is a vehicle for Priscilla Dean, who's quite great in the film, but it's also a film that's usually labeled as a gangster picture, but that's really also a bit of a misnomer because while there are gangster characters, it becomes very quickly more of a character melodrama for the bulk and majority of the film. To make up, I guess, for the lack of Chaney in the film, he actually has a second role. So he plays two roles in the film, but the second role is much more of a minor character, and unfortunately it is an example of what was quite commonplace at the time of casting an actor in makeup as another ethnicity in a character that is obviously more of a racial stereotype. And the version that we have that survives, because the film was reissued in 1926 with some edits made, it does seem to be that second character of Ah Wing who was removed from the film in terms of the scenes featuring that character were toned down and removed. So we only have part of that performance. The other thing to discuss is the film in its surviving versions that we have for this restoration does have nitrate decomposition in some of the last reels. And unfortunately, this does harm the climax, and in particular, most notably, when the two Chaney characters actually fight each other in the big explosive climax of the film. So unfortunately, it does make it a little hard to follow the action because the entire screen is obscured at times due to the decomposition. But again, we're lucky to have any version of this film survive because for most of the 20th century, it simply did not exist. Again, it wasn't discovered again until the mid to late 1970s, and then was still a very rare film to see. And this restoration was extraordinarily necessary because it is an important work for everyone involved, even though it's not going to be the Todd Browning, Lon Chaney experience we've come to expect from Browning's themes and Chaney's explorations into the macabre. The basic plot of Outside the Law is essentially set up to get us to the character melodrama, but it's actually quite striking in a number of ways in that it's a bit atypical, and it does start to get more into the psychological motivations of the characters. So while I would still consider it technically a gangster film, it's a gangster film from 1920 that's trying to actually have some greater depth to the main characters and give them real psychological motivations and real crisis of conscience. And it's not the clear-cut sort of cops and robbers stories that you might expect, especially for a film of this time. And I think that's one of the most unique elements that makes it hold up all these years later, and in some areas actually feel quite a bit modern and have at least some energy and drive to it. But it is also very obviously a melodrama about the two characters, and Chaney's character of Black Mike the gangster, unfortunately, is a supporting player and only appears in small increments. And when he's on screen, the energy of the film just goes into the stratosphere and you can't take your eyes off of him. So unfortunately, they didn't make him the main character or more of a presence. And again, while he has the second character, that character is dramatically reduced in terms of the version we have. The plot revolves around Priscilla Dean's character of Molly, who is the daughter of Silent Madden, the great gangster in town. And they have been visiting a Chinese philosopher, Chang Lo, played by E. Alan Warren, who is trying to essentially convince them to live a peaceable life and go straight. And they're sort of going along with it and starting to see the light, as it were. So this is already a bit atypical for a story of this type of this time period. And actually having Chinese philosophy being used as something positive and something that could encourage a positive change in people is also notable, although you again have non-Asian actors in Asian roles, which was unfortunately a common practice of the time period. So this being a 1920 film, you do have to come to expect that. Although interestingly, a lot of the other sort of background characters we see in the film are Asian actors, and really notably, it's a sort of blink and you miss it thing, but in one short sequence, you have a bunch of young girls who are basically looking into the camera, and one of them happens to be Anna May Wong when she was very young. So that's another treat for viewers of this film who are classic Hollywood fans, because it's one of those sort of moments where you sort of do a double take for a second because she's so much younger than we're used to seeing her that it takes you a second, and then you go, hey, wait, is that who I think it is? So interestingly, they were at least filling out some of the other background roles with other actual Asian actors, but the main roles of Chang Lo and then the Chaney character of Ah Wing, of course, are not. And Ah Wing is a very minor character who's basically the subservient character to Chang Lo. So he's basically the assistant slash butler slash handyman who's just kind of sitting in the back of the room all the time. And it's rather strange that they had Chaney play this very small role, but again, it probably made more sense in the more complete original version where that character did have some more scenes. Of course, when you see Chaney here, while he obviously was the man of a thousand faces, he did play Asian characters from time to time, and of course it requires makeup, and of course is not a practice that is politically correct, but was very commonplace at the time, and it's also not very convincing either, as most of these makeup jobs usually are. It's of course fascinating to see Chaney play a second character in the same film, but one really wishes that more time had just been devoted instead to the Black Mike character, the main gangster that Chaney is playing, because that's where the real interest lies for the audience. Chaney's Black Mike is essentially the third man or another man in their organization of criminals who, for some reason, has a grudge against Madden and sets him up for murder and basically gets him out of the equation, and then has part of his evil plan is to also destroy the daughter and show them that their attempts to go straight were wrong and get her essentially arrested and thrown in jail as well, and then take over the criminal empire himself. This is done by setting up a rather daring jewel robbery in the middle of a big society gathering. Molly's accompanied by Dapper Bill, who's played by Wheeler Oakman, who's essentially the co-star with Priscilla Dean. He's the major love interest. And they manage to pull off the heist, but he tells her about the double cross that Black Mike has planned, and because he has developed some sort of conscience. So essentially they manage to escape with the jewels and duck out the side door so they're not caught in the police trap, and then are on the run and have to hide out for a significant period of time while things cool off. Of course, they know that Black Mike and the entire gang is looking for them, and so are the police, and they can't do anything with the priceless jewels they've absconded with. So essentially, they're holed up in an apartment and trying to not go stir crazy. And interestingly, it's the Molly character who's holding it together more and much better than her male counterpart. And she's also the one who keeps the stiff upper lip and keeps the mentality of, we have to lay low. We're criminals on the run. This is our nest egg, these jewels we've stolen. And this is really the bulk of the film, where they're trying to not obviously get caught and give themselves up, and also not go stir crazy and not be caught by either of the factions looking for them. And things develop from there. And of course, so does their potentially blossoming romance. And this is further enhanced by the fact that next door is a family with a small boy who loves to come over, and Bill can't get enough of this little kid. And amusingly, this is much to Molly's consternation, because they're criminals trying to lay low, and here's her supposed help always playing with a little 5-year-old and acting all goofy and things, and doing things that might possibly get them caught. So of course she's not pleased with any of this. As I said before, this is the bulk of the film's story. It really becomes a character melodrama about these two characters. We also don't get a whole lot of the other factions. We get little 1 or 2 cutaway scenes to Chaney's Black Mike trying to find them, or the police, or Molly's father in jail, but those are actually very few and far between. Eventually, things do start to get dicey for our two characters, and that brings all the factions together in, actually, I'd say one of several climactic moments. What's probably the most striking element and the most modern element about Outside the Law is that the final act of the film has not one but 2 really drag out, knockdown fights that you've got characters getting their clothes ripped, and there's a knife involved, and there's blood, and then there's gunplay, and the final big battle between all of our characters. But the 2 major brawls in the final act they're quite vicious, especially for the time period. Again, everybody gets roughed up or is cut up or bruised or bleeding, and their clothes are torn. And the final battle is actually, it's actually multiple different fights going on, both inside and outside of a building. So it's actually quite complex, especially for a 1920 film. And again, you've got all these characters getting roughed up or potentially even killed. And it's quite striking for a 1920 film, because you didn't see this level of intensity and violence that was actually detailed to a certain degree very often, especially in a Universal film. So I think this may be an element where you see at least some of the Todd Browning sense of the macabre coming in, because otherwise you would not see this as a Todd Browning film. It doesn't have any of his core themes. It doesn't have any of the themes that Chaney himself revisited time and time again. So it does feel very alien if you're coming to this from the other Browning and Chaney films, and that's usually the biggest hurdle for people to get over, because we all come to Outside the Law expecting that, and we don't get that. But what we do get is a quite well done character melodrama that's also a gangster film, where at least the main characters do have a bit more development to them. But you have to keep in mind, it's a vehicle for Priscilla Dean. So really, she's got the standout role in most of the screen time. And she's really excellent. One can see why she was such a star at the time. And in particular, I really enjoyed when she was really embracing the criminal lifestyle, or trying to be a top crook. And then when they're holed up in an apartment, and she's trying to maintain the stiff upper lip and not get caught and not be melted by her rather ineffectual partner in crime's charms. When she's maintaining that sort of stony front, she's quite adorable in ways, and it's nice to see a lead female character at this time have more of that sort of gumption in her character, and that's what I responded to most. So one can see why she was such a star at the time. The issue is that there's not enough Chaney in the film. There really isn't, because when he appears as the gangster Black Mike, I mean, as with any Chaney appearance, he just radiates off the screen. He radiates menace. He radiates energy, and when he appears, you know that people are going to die. You just know it. So the film needed more of the Black Mike character for sure, and one does have to balance that with the fact that we don't have the complete 1920 film. We have something that's very close to it, but there are certain pieces that were removed in 1926 for that reissue, and it's possible that may have made the film feel a bit more complete, although and it does have more Chaney footage, but it is of the Ah Wing sort of secondary character. And I don't know if it would really change the film all that much, or if it's really that much footage that we're even discussing here of the 1920 original versus the slightly trimmed 1926 reissue. But anytime you've got a situation like that, it's always possible that having that footage reinstated could make the actual flow of the film feel at least a little bit more natural. Now, while I said on the surface that this wouldn't really seem like a Todd Browning film, he actually did get a screenwriting credit. So he was a writer, or the primary writer on the film, and there are some religious themes that pop up that do feel at least tied to some of the other religious themes and imagery that pops up in other Browning films. So if you really start to look at it closely, you can maybe start to sift out a few sort of Browning style elements, but still it doesn't have that sort of traditional Browning macabre sense that we think of, that we associate with him so much. But if you look really closely, you might be able to sift out a few things here and there. Also, interestingly, the great director Leo McCarey actually was an assistant director on this film. So even though he obviously didn't have the greatest amount of impact, here's Leo McCarey on a film that was quite successful at the time, with two incredibly iconic men of the silent era in a film that does have quite striking moments scattered throughout, and one that remains incredibly engaging and entertaining, and I think plays well even with a modern audience, especially in this restoration. The one thing you're going to run into, though, at once you get over the hurdle of this is not like the other Browning and Chaney films that we think of from later in the 20s. There's no sense of the macabre. There's no characters obsessed with mutilation or darker themes, and it's not a Chaney vehicle. He's really just got a secondary role. It's a Priscilla Dean vehicle. The major issue, though, is more on the technical side. It's that nitrate decomposition in the last reel or two that you run into, because it's so significant in two of the, well, really in one of the biggest moments of the final act, and then the climactic fight battle at the very end of the film is riddled with it. So unfortunately, it's just baked into the lone element that we have to work from, and one can very obviously tell that this is literally all there is, and we're lucky to have the feature complete. But do keep in mind you're going to run into that, and it does obscure the screen in those two moments. It comes and goes, but unfortunately, that's just the only remaining source we have. And while it does make watching the climactic battle at the end a little hard and difficult to always follow the action, you can at least follow most of it, and you get the idea, but that's just something due to the ravages of time, and there's nothing you can do about it. And this restoration does basically the best it can with what survives. So to talk about the picture quality, this is another one of these miraculous universal 4K restorations of a silent classic, and outside of the moments of nitrate decomposition, this looks incredible. And because they're working from a 35mm source for the majority of the feature, the quality level is quite striking throughout. I would say most of the feature looks absolutely stunning, especially for a 1920 film. So this is very much on the level of other silent restorations on Blu-ray that have been able to use 35mm sources. So most of the feature looks stunning. There are some moments where the shots are softer. There is, of course, inherent damage and wear. That is to be expected for a film that was lost for most of the 20th century. But there are also one or two moments where I think they did have to mix in some of that 16mm footage. So there are a couple moments scattered throughout where there is a bit of a quality dip, because they are having to sort of patch in the one or two other lesser sources. But for the majority of the feature, it looks absolutely stunning. It's really only in the final act of the film where you have the two instances of really bad nitrate decomposition. And if you don't know what that looks like on a transfer, basically you're going to start seeing white elements, and I'll include screen caps, but essentially you see what looks like white splotches at first, and then it gets much bigger and bigger, and then the whole screen can be obscured or mostly obscured, and it kind of comes and goes. So there's really nothing you can do about that. But at least with modern scanning technology and digital tools, it's possible to work with elements to at least get some sort of image capture and then do the best you can with it. Unfortunately, this does affect quite a number of silent films that survive, but here, thankfully, it's just contained to those two sequences, which unfortunately are in the climax of the film and the final act. So it is what it is, but thankfully, the rest of the feature is as good as it can be. It looks frequently stunning, and at least we do have a complete version of the film, although that would technically be more of a complete version of the slightly trimmed 1926 reissue. So, hopefully there's another element that turns up for Outside the Law at some point that has that little bit of extra footage, and hopefully there's a clean version of the final act that doesn't have the nitrate decomposition in it. But that's very unlikely. One can still hope, of course, but Universal has done their absolute best to really knock this out of the park. So this is another of their staggering must-see restorations in the 4K realm of one of their silent classics, and it's great that they are at least targeting a lot of the Chaney films that they have in their library to do as these 4K restorations. So this joins other classics that they've sort of resuscitated, like their amazing Hunchback of Notre Dame restoration and other titles that they've handled. So I'm really pleased that they're continuing to restore silent films at this level of quality in their overall catalog overhaul project. As I said before, you do have to come into this expecting inherent wear and damage. So of course there's scratches, frame movement, hairs, all kinds of wear and tear, and we're just lucky to have this film at all, but of course that is to be expected for a 1920 film that has only barely survived in just a few elements that we have to work from. The main thing I noticed are, of course, obviously there's going to be a few missing frames here and there, and then there are one or two spots where there seems like there's a little bit of image shrinkage or a little bit of warpage. It's very minor, but there are one or two spots of that in addition to the usual sort of expected wear and tear, but none of this is outside the law of what I would expect of a silent film that has barely survived from 1920. So all of this is to be expected, and overall Universal has done a stellar job because the quality level throughout the majority of the feature is really stunning. So this is one of those silent restorations where you can literally be watching it and just get lost in the level of detail as a sort of time capsule. And because we're able to work from a 35mm source, and you're getting a much higher quality presentation level than what you get with a lot of silent restorations that are having to work from more limited elements. So again, Universal really knocked it out of the park here. The major issue, though, is that they did have to deal with the final act having those two extreme moments of nitrate decomposition. Eureka has also done a really fantastic job on the disc encoding. I was very pleased to see that this had have a quite high bitrate throughout, which I've come to expect from Eureka releases, which is why I usually opt for them over other labels here in the US putting out the same masters, whether it be Kino or Shout or somebody. Almost always the Eureka release is the better encoded and better technical presentation. But here, the bitrate is averaging usually in the mid to high 30s and sometimes goes into the 40s, which is extraordinarily rare to see on a Blu-ray release. So this is extremely well encoded and a wonderful technical presentation by Eureka of this Universal 4K restoration. Now, the audio is a lossless stereo presentation of a new score by Anton Senko, which suits the film beautifully and is a great score. I've seen this film once before in a not very good version, and the score was merely okay, but seeing it this way with this new score did greatly enhance the film, and I really enjoyed seeing it in this new restoration. It definitely played better in this new master with this new score than it did when I saw it years and years ago, looking and sounding not very good. And again, you do get the benefit of having a lossless stereo presentation on the Eureka disc. Now, to talk about the packaging and artwork, this is done as part of Eureka's Masters of Cinema line, spine number 263, and of course utilizes original poster artwork, which looks fantastic on this. The Kino Lorber release of the same master did also use original poster art, but I think the artwork Eureka went with is more eye-grabbing, and it also features essentially headshots of our lead three and gets Chaney on the cover as well. So I really like the image they chose and the layout and how it fits with the Masters of Cinema banner. So of course we have the traditional Eureka spine and their traditional rear done to match the sort of brown of the cover. The interior is quite nice with a lovely choice for disc art. We also have a lovely image chosen for the tray and background, which gives us Chaney as Black Mike and the corner of town looking all dark and nasty, and this very much gives you the atmosphere of what the film is like. Eureka also nicely gives us a booklet with beautiful original artwork, which is printed horizontally, basically giving us another sort of theater lobby card style advertisement. This has lovely imagery and also has a brand new essay by Richard Combs talking about the film and, of course, Priscilla Dean and Lon Chaney and Todd Browning and where this film kind of came in their career, and giving us a nice sort of analysis on the film with good images, and it runs for a good number of pages. So this basically goes for about 16 pages, and then we get the traditional Eureka viewing notes, also encouraging people to not have their television stretching the image or have motion smoothing on, which I always appreciate how they put that note in there. And then the same beautiful shot of Chaney in profile. For the supplements, we only really have 2 if you don't count the booklet. If you count the booklet, it's technically 3. So we obviously have the Universal 4K restoration with the new stereo score. The major extra is a new interview piece with Kim Newman, and of course this is another quite lengthy general discussion about the film and the world of the film and the careers of the people involved. And if you've ever seen one of Kim Newman's pieces on basically any release, you know what to expect. So it's another really well done conversation that runs through a lot of different topics and gets into greater detail on Browning, Chaney, and Priscilla Dean, and where Outside the Law kind of falls, coming in at 1920, and how this is obviously before the Browning and Chaney partnership really took off at MGM a couple years later, but also where Outside the Law a bit kind of comes in to the emerging gangster genre, because this is still long before it had become solidified with the Warner's classic starting in 1931, and of course Scarface in 1932, but also that this film was actually remade not once but twice. Todd Browning actually remade Outside the Law in 1930 with Edward G. Robinson, which is a fascinating film to look at if you can find it, of course, in a decent version. But Browning, interesting return to a lot of his past successes as sound remakes, either in name, like Outside the Law, or indirectly, like Mark of the Vampire reworking London After Midnight, or The Devil Doll reworking elements of several Browning films, but primarily the Unholy Three. So he wasn't the only person to do this, but he did it quite a number of times and more than most people realized. But that's not all, because apparently somebody at Universal really liked the story idea, because they actually took another stab at it and came up with the 1946 film Inside Job, which is technically another remake of Outside the Law, and Todd Browning even gets a story credit, although it is very much reworked and things. There's technically a second remake version from Universal as well, so Newman talks about that a little bit, and I had heard of that other one but kind of forgotten about it, so now I'm very curious to go and check that out. But it's interesting how Universal did start to mine even their silent catalog for remake purposes even in the 1940s. The other extra is an alternate ending, basically created for that 1926 reissue, which is taken from a 16mm source, and obviously of lesser quality, does have some baked-in damage and things. But what's interesting is it does have alternate takes and footage from different camera angles of the finale of the film, and it's also a dramatically different edit, because it does basically skip most of the final fight, and then it does have an extra epilogue scene with our 2 main characters, basically the would-be lovers. So it's interesting that there's that unique piece it's just basically the tag ending here on the 1926 reissue version, which is otherwise heavily cut down and restructured from the main fight ending of the 1920 original. So it's fascinating that it survived and we can actually look at it. And it's amazing to see that extra little bit of new material in what is otherwise just reworked and different angles and a different edit, a dramatically reduced edit in terms of the runtime version of the climax of the film. So overall, that is the Eureka Region B release of the Universal 4K restoration of the 1920 classic Outside the Law. I do think it's a fantastic restoration considering the elements that are available and the fact that the film was lost for a great number of decades. I think it's very important to look at for Browning's career. I do think it is a nice development in his career, and I do think if you study it closely enough, you can see some of his fingerprints in terms of themes and flourishes. And of course, we have a standout performance from Lon Chaney, even though while he had already become a star, this is basically him being the character actor once again, and he's exceptional, even though the second role is really unnecessary and is unfortunately, standard casting practices of the time. But it is a film that does still play quite well and does have enough energy to it that it can retain the attention of a modern audience. And when it really gets to those climactic fight scenes, they are quite gripping and quite strikingly violent for the time period. There's a real two-fisted quality to them that I didn't expect, and every time I revisit this film, I always kind of forget about that, and then I get to those moments again. I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot how bloodied up they get, and how their clothes get torn, and how there's a certain quality of desperation. And once again, I was struck at how good Priscilla Dean is in the film. So I think she's the other real major standout. But the whole cast does a great job. It's just not the Browning and Chaney film that we come to expect. This predates that, so you have to go into this film for the first time knowing not to expect the Unholy Three or the Unknown or West of Zanzibar. We're not at those delirious heights of the macabre and darkness yet, but this is at least getting to be a building block towards those and developing their relationship. And it holds up remarkably well. And again, it's amazing we can even see this film because it was lost for so long. So this comes with my highest recommendation. I think it's absolutely essential for Browning and Chaney fans, for all silent fans. It's really well done. It moves very quickly, and it doesn't ever get bogged down too much in the character melodrama. And there's enough psychological development and layering of our main three characters to keep things interesting and to make it feel a little bit more modern than what you would expect. So there's quite a bit more going on in Outside the Law than what most people would expect from a 1920 film, especially once they go in realizing that it's not an out-and-out gangster film, even though that's the genre it's in, and it's also not an out-and-out Chaney and Browning film like we expect from their other classics from later in the silent era. But once you get past that, it remains quite effective, filled with great performances, and again, those fantastic fight scenes towards the end in the climax. So unfortunately, there is the nitrate decomposition towards the end of the film, but outside of that, this is really as good as it's going to get, and it looks fantastic. And Universal's once again done a stellar job. And whether you pick up the Kino or Eureka release, you will be able to see an important stepping stone in the careers of Todd Browning and Lon Chaney. The major difference between the two releases, between the Eureka and the Kino, is that the Kino does have an exclusive commentary track, which I wish had been able to be ported over here, but Eureka got Kim Newman to do an interview piece, one of his lengthy chats, so there's a bit of a trade-off. But I do think the Eureka is the better option overall. I think it has a better art design. I think it has a great booklet. It has the astounding inclusion of the alternate ending from the reissue, which is also on the Kino, but I think the Kim Newman chat is well done as always, and those are so information stuff that they can kind of take the place of a commentary, although it's still not quite the same. I would have loved to have seen a commentary on this release. But also, this is incredibly well encoded, and I know it's going to be better than the Kino encoding. So I think that definitely swings it towards the Eureka, and you can usually get this in one of their site sales for quite cheap. So you just need to have region-free capability if you're like me in the US, which really I think is essential for all film fans because there's so many great releases in Region B and other areas of the world that we're just not seeing here in the US, or titles that are not getting a release here. So I do think it's essential to get a region-free player. And I think there are times where the Eureka or other UK label releases are the better option, or technically better enough to warrant a purchase of that version of what we have in the US. So it's still the same great restoration on either release, and you're basically having to pick and choose between the two. But even though it doesn't have a commentary, I do think the Eureka is the better option, and I like the art design more, and I think it's really well encoded, so that always gets my vote too on the technical level. So I think this is another really truly important silent film release, another worthy addition to the Eureka Masters of Cinema line, and I think this is another must-own in that MOC line from Eureka. So this is a no-brainer for classic horror fans of Browning and Chaney, a no-brainer for Chaney fans, and honestly, it's a no-brainer for fans of the gangster genre, because I do think in a lot of ways this is a very important early film for the emergence of the gangster genre, even though this is significantly before the real explosion with Little Caesar and the Public Enemy in 31. And while it does get more into character melodrama, it's also developing these characters more, and making the world of this film feel a little bit more lived in, which is something that you didn't always get in films of this time period. So I think on those levels, it's also important and something that fans of gangster films will get something out of. So I think this is just another must-own silent Blu-ray release, whether you've got the Kino or the Eureka, and Universal really knocked it out of the park with this restoration. So as always, I hope my babblings about classic films and silent films and physical media releases has been at least somewhat fun and informative. If you've seen Outside the Law before, but you haven't seen this Universal restoration, you're really in for a treat, because they knocked it out of the park, as they've been doing with all of their 4K silent restorations. So this is another must-own silent Blu-ray release, and it's essential if you're a fan of either Todd Browning or Lon Chaney, as you should be. So this, I think, is a worthwhile addition to any silent film library, and it's a must for all Blu-ray collections. So as always, please do keep supporting both studios and boutique labels by buying films on disc to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.